Assalamu alaikum, a greeting of peace and a very good afternoon, I guess, or morning still. This is the fifth session, the role of education in nurturing moderation. I think we are running extremely late, and I just had a discussion with the panels. We have decided that we will stick to the 15 minutes each for the panels so that they have some meaningful thing to contribute and have a 15 minutes conversation at the end of the presentation. Because time is running late, I'm not going to say very much, except that education, I think, is important in trying to nurture moderation, to shape mindsets, to acculturate, to set values for us to make sure that moderation is sustainable and is part of the way of living. So without further ado, I would want to call on the speakers to speak for 15 minutes maximum so that we have time to ask some questions and also clarify some issues. With me here at the podium, basically, we have Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Dato Dr. Koo Kay Kim on my immediate right. He's a Chancellor of the KDU University College and also a very eminent historian, as all of us know. Beside him is Yang Berbahagia Dato Dr. Said Ali Taufik Al-Attas, who is advisor of the Al-Bukhari Foundation and also advisor to the MPH publishing house. Beside him is a Professor Mahbubani, the Dean and Professor of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Singapore. And beside him is Tan Sri Dato Dr. Wan Muhammad Zahid Nordin, who is the chairman of the University Technology Mara. So all the detailed bibliography is in the book. You are free to refer to them if you want to know more details about the speaker. So I would like to begin with Professor Mahbubani because he has to leave early to catch a flight from Singapore. Professor, please take the floor. 15 minutes is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me begin with an apology. This is going to be what they call a hit and run operation because I have a flight to catch at 2:30 and I'm told that I have to leave here by 12:35, 12:40 if I'm going to make it to the airport in time to catch the flight, because I'm actually flying tonight to Istanbul and then from there to Paris and Davos, where, as you know, the whole world will congregate next week. But I'm very glad that I could be here, and I congratulate Prime Minister Najib for having launched this conference. It is very timely, and I hope it will make a big difference. Now, given the shortage of time, I will, Mr. Chairman, only make 3 points in 15 minutes or less. And the 3 points I'm going to make, hopefully, relatively what you might call big points about the larger picture. The first big point is that globally, there is good news. Moderation is growing. And I'll try and give you some statistics to illustrate that. And my second point is that let's try to understand what are the larger underlying factors that are actually driving this increasing moderation in the world. If we understand the factors, we can try to help. And thirdly and finally, I'll talk about also the role of education and the important role that it plays. And I will also mention that education plays a rather paradoxical role, sometimes actually supporting moderation and sometimes not. Again, I'll illustrate with examples. So those are the 3 points I hope to cover in the time allotted to me. So let me begin by the big point to prove that global moderation is going. And here I wonder how many of you have read a new book by a Harvard professor called Steven Pinker called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And it's a fascinating book to look at because he looks at the history of violence over the past 2,000 years. And he shows over the past 2,000 years, if you document it, less and less people are dying from violence, less and less people are dying from wars. And this is true even in our time. And why do I say even in our time? Because as you know, if you look at the Western depiction of the state of the world, it is best captured in the very famous statement by George W. Bush when he said, after 9/11, he said, "We live in a very dangerous time, and it is getting even more dangerous by the day." George W. Bush. And guess what? Less and less people have been dying in the times that he's been saying that the world has been getting more dangerous. Just to illustrate one statistic, okay? Over the past 60 years, since the end of World War II, we used to have, 60 years ago, about 500,000 people dying from conflicts every year. That number is now down to 30,000, less than 10% of what it used to be. So clearly, something has changed fundamentally in the world. And if you look at it objectively, the danger of war today between any two major powers is very low. With, of course, as you know, one exception, and I saw it was mentioned in the last session, if there is one area where you really need to pay attention to because the danger of war is real, is of course what's happening between the United States and Iran. And that's a very dangerous situation because both sides clearly do not understand each other. With that exception, and I believe me, I wake up worrying about what's going to happen across the in the Iranian region. If you look at the world, everywhere else, at every other hotspot in the world, you see across the Taiwan Straits, look at South Asia, look at everywhere, the prospects of war are diminishing. And at the same time, by the way, there is another phenomenon that is happening, which is the explosion of the global middle classes. Just to give you one statistic, the number of people living in the middle class today in Asia is 500 million people. But it will grow to 1.75 billion people by 2020. 3.5 times it'll increase. And this explosion of the middle classes, you can find a clear correlation between growth of middle classes and peace, because middle classes do not want to go to war. They share the same aspirations as those in the West to have a stable and comfortable life. So that's the good news. Now, the second part, of course, is why is the world becoming a safer place? And this, frankly, you have to write several books on the subject, but I'll just mention two larger forces before coming to my third point about education. I think technology has done a brilliant job because technology has essentially shrunk the world and created one small global village. And why is that important? Because when you live in a village, small village, and you know your neighbors, it's very hard to demonize somebody who lives next door to you. So you understand them. You feel a sense of empathy for them. And you saw this recently when you had the Chilean miners trapped underground for several weeks, and the whole world was praying for them. They're in Chile, far away, in a distant mine, but the whole world was praying for them. Why? Technology. And similarly, the forces of globalization have also accelerated the shrinking of the world. People are traveling overseas. The number of tourists traveling across borders is exploding. We know each other better. Conferences like this that bring people from all over the world, all this to help to create in a sense of moderation, a removal of extremism, because you get to know each other, and therefore moderation is increased. Now let me touch on the key point that we're supposed to discuss in this session, the role of education. Now why do I say that education has a paradoxical dimension? And here let me specifically look at the role of education in the West. Because if you look, for example, at how Asia has transformed itself and why Asia today is the most promising region in the world by far, compared to the doom and gloom you get in America, the doom and gloom you get in Europe, everybody knows, and I've said this in my previous book, the future belongs to Asia. Why? Because the Asians have invested massively in education. And clearly, if the Asians want to send a thank you note, they should send a thank you note to American universities. Because you look at the numbers, just this year alone, 120,000 Chinese, 100,000 Indians, 80,000 Koreans, and I can go on, studying in American universities. And why is that important? It's important because it is creating among the elites of Asia a common language, a common frame of reference. So when a leader from Japan or a leader from Korea meets a leader from Indonesia or a leader from India, what do they talk about? How to modernize, how to grow the economy, the concepts that they use to talk to each other, often in English, all derivations of the Western education system, and that's one large reason why this region, as you know, is coming closer and closer together. So Western education, in that sense, has done good things. But the paradox about Western education, and here I'm of course making a very sensitive point, is that while it has on the one hand educated the elites of the rest of the world, Western education has failed to educate Western elites. Now, what do I mean by that? If you look, for example, at levels of understanding of the world, of the complex world that we live in, you will not find it in the Western elites. And if you want proof, let me give you one simple example. The most intellectual candidate, the guy with a PhD among the American Republicans, is a man called Newt Gingrich, who describes himself as the intellectual, the scholar of all the candidates. And what does he say? He says, well, the Palestinians are an invented people. Right? Now, excuse me, if you want to talk about invented people, the Americans are an invented people. 1,000 years ago, there were no Americans. But 1,000 years ago, there were Palestinians. Right? Now, despite saying a statement which was complete rubbish, he doesn't get crucified. He continues his campaign, and not a single leading American figure dares to stand up and expose this ignorance. Why? And this is not, again, a big secret. Because of cowardice when it comes to dealing with anything with Israel and Palestine in the Western discourse. And that's a paradox we got to figure out. Why is it that Western education has done so well in educating the rest of the world and not in educating itself? And what we know, but these are, of course, realities that we have to live with, right? We have to live with the fact that the United States remains the greatest power in the world. So what the United States does matter. And you saw this, for example, even this morning at this conference, right? When you schedule this conference in the morning, you give 2 hours to one American scholar and 1 hour to 4 Asians. That's power. That's geopolitical reality. And you acknowledge, and I am a realist. I know that's a fact. But maybe, let me suggest as a last point, maybe the time has come for Asians to show more respect towards each other and consider the possibility that maybe the time has come for Asians to learn from fellow Asians, to perhaps go and study in each other's universities. And this is where I hope, I'm Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. Only 20% of our students come from Singapore. 80% come from the rest of the world, from China, India, ASEAN, US, Europe. But here we are trying in our own region to create something that we believe can make a difference. And we hope that as a result of this conference, more Asians will support Asian schools. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Tan Sri Chairman, honored panel members, ladies and gentlemen. First, let me thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to participate in this forum. I feel greatly honored. And I'd like to say what I want to say. And I hope the Chairman may indulge a little bit more than what you have allocated, given the fact that more than an hour has been accorded for one speaker. I guess I may be allowed that kind of a generosity from the Chairman. I believe that it's the substance of the seminar rather than time being the substance of it all. I intend to present a perspective which may not necessarily be the usual approach. And in the course of this approach, I may make what may appear to be sweeping statements, which may cause some degree of apprehension, and which may contradict with each other how we look at the world. I guess so be it. This is how one views the world. The topic might be simple. It is simple if one adopted the functionalist paradigm as a way of explaining the educational institution. And this perspective borders on the Weberian ideal type of formal approach. If you adopt such an approach, the predisposition is to enumerate what education should do and should not do, and then we hand over our wish list to the people in charge of educational institution and let them figure out how it is to be implemented. The other perspective is to view education from a dynamic, functional perspective and regard education as an organization, as an institution, as a problem to be explained. This approach distances itself from the a priori approach of the functionalist model, but regard a priori as a problem to be explained. And scholars of this persuasion adopt such an approach because they believe that there are certain dynamics from within and from without the organization that exert a strong influence on an organization, be it educational or corporate institutions. And these tend to steer the organization or the institution from performing the original functions that are assigned to the organization. In the functionalist approach, we would happily enumerate what education should do, and we feel we have done our job when we have done just that. Unfortunately, the functionalist approach is predicated on the assumption that education is an island unto itself, seemingly impervious to the influences of its environment. And contrary to such a perspective, education is in fact a creature of the environment. The environment creates the educational institutions, and there are specific expectations or demands made by the environment on education. Well, this is a fair expectation, and there is nothing wrong with that. The first school that was created was predicated on the overriding quest to formalize the learning of skills and values desired by society. And values, by definition, are things prized, and there are many things prized by society, like good form, good behavior, respect for law and order, respect for the elderly. Good form, like preferred social decorum, and so on and so forth. Obviously, these prized things cannot occur at random. A formal institution must be established. So we set up the educational institution. These are great, elegant expectations. And many from less endowed countries would flock to the well-endowed institutions in the West to learn at the feet of these esteemed professors with regard to their esteemed civilization. Indeed, education is regarded as the agent of change. A question may be asked, has education really made the world any better than we first found it? Has the world, through the intervention of education, become saner and safer than it was before? Has education reduced racism? Has education produced high moral value leaders who would not lie through their teeth to the world over some unfounded claims to justify certain questionable actions of theirs? Has the world now become more dangerous than it ever was in its history? Are we now heading to the Hobbesian problem of a war of all against all? Or are we there already? Let us examine some of the empirical regularities with regard to the environment that envelops education. Almost everywhere we see hostilities despite the presence of educational institutions. Since the dramatic event of Habil and Qabil, or Cain and Abel, until this day, man has been at war with one another. Just as one war ended, the drumbeat of another could be heard. If we thought the war in Iraq and Afghanistan would come to a close, we were now given notice of another one in the making. And each time hostilities take on its disastrous course, the world is placed on the precipice of Armageddon. We all held our breath at one time when two warring nations threatened to lob their weapons of total annihilation at each other. Thankfully, the crisis came to pass. But one day, the threat may translate into reality. That's extremism at country level. At the education level, the bastion of reason and goodwill, incipient extremism has found its way in the campus. Differences in ideology are no longer a matter of academic divergence, but constitute real, irreconcilable, pathological differences, and hostilities among the so-called learned are as real can be, no matter what the rationale of the warring parties might be from both sides of the ideological divide. Bearing this in mind, these empirical regularities of extremism, to cite but a few, has education succeeded in producing the kind of individuals with a sense of moderation, balance, and proportion about many things that we prized? Notwithstanding such empirical regularities cited above, as an educationist, I say education has the solemn duty, ability, and the capacity to deliver the cherished ideals of society, but under certain conditions. The environment must do the needful to change itself for the better, to provide the necessary ambience for the education institutions to discharge its functions effectively. Leaders, particularly the powerful ones, must demonstrate their earnest desire to promote goodwill and good form. And you cannot speak with slippery tongue. The importance of creating the supportive ambience for education cannot be overemphasized. This is because, as mentioned earlier, education is not an island unto itself. It is a creature of society. Education cannot change society if society ignores its attendant effects on education. To expect education to change society is to expect the tail to wag the dog. It is to be mentioned that formal education encompasses a phenomenon called curriculum, comprising two principal domains that must be in constant equilibrium with each other. Strategically, they must be in perfect harmony with each other if we want to produce the individuals with the desired and desirable attributes. One domain is what is called the cognitive domain, and the other, the affective domain. Simply put, the former deals with knowledge, the latter values. This is the curriculum that buttresses the educational initiative of the formal institution. The purpose of the curriculum is predicated on the idea of providing students with the correct and proper educational experience. This is because education is experience, and experience is education. In short, the curriculum is the experiential menu that we serve to students at schools and universities. It must be understood that the cognitive or knowledge domain deals with the outer part of the individual. This is the easiest part because it is easily imparted, easily monitored, and easily evaluated. You just dish out the skills and knowledge to be acquired by the individuals by way of teaching him the skills of the subjects or disciplines to be learned, like engineering or physics or finance, and the students, especially the bright ones, will make a great engineer, a brilliant scientist, or a financial wizard. But insofar as skills is concerned only. This is the outer part of humanity, and one cannot make an inferential leap by thinking that the knowledge and skills given will enhance and enrich his inner soul. The other domain of the curriculum is what is called the affective domain. This is a curriculum area that deals with values, not to be memorized cognitively, because values are caught and not taught, but to be internalized. This area deals with the human soul, if you like, the inner part of man. This is man's affection of the highest order, because it describes the way in which the individual reacts emotionally and his ability to empathize, that is, to feel another living thing's pain or joy. The affective domain seeks to create in the inner soul of the individual a heightened sense of awareness and growth in attitudes, emotion, and feelings. The two domains, if and when pursued with equal passion and commitment, will produce the person with a sense of moderation, balance, and proportion. The cognitive is the id and ego. The affective is the superego, or the alter ego, if you like. When the cognitive genius, id and ego, are out to do mischief, the superego, acting as the inner voice, would stand in the way. It is to be stated that while education institutions recognize the need for a balanced approach in implementing curriculum, they have not succeeded in doing so in the fullest sense of the term. The environment must share a large measure of the blame for the inability of education to discharge its balanced function. The obsessive material race to achieve economic competitive advantage in order to pursue higher and higher GDP growth has unwittingly put the effective curriculum on the back burner. A renowned world institution, in its recent report to the government, hammered education for its inability to orient its education system to the needs of the industry in order to achieve economic growth. This renowned world body went on to suggest that more high exchange value courses be offered so as to ensure that the curriculum of the education system harmonizes with the skill needs of the industries. The world body advocated for the increase of high exchange value courses to be served in educational institutions, as such is the royal road to attain material wealth. Multinational corporations threatened to pull out and put their investment elsewhere if the country did not produce the skilled workers that it required. Consequently, educational institutions, being a creature of the environment, cannot help but adapt to the compelling demands of the industry. Obviously, no one talks about values for the inner soul, because aspects like morality, religion, and spiritual values, the stuffs for producing a morally feeling person, do not appear to fit in the industrial scheme of things. Such events demonstrate that education is just a creature of the environment. Having said all this, it is the case of a balanced education to produce a person with a sense of moderation, balance, and proportion, and act in futility? I do not think so. First, I do not believe that there need be a tension between the cognitive and the affective domains in the educational institutions. It need not be a zero-sum game. It did not mean that if an institution gives emphasis to the affective domains, it will result in reducing the GDP of the nation. The educational institutions are built to address equally the two domains. For that to happen, the environment must play its role to ensure that the tension that produces the zero-sum syndrome does not disturb the curriculum order of educational institutions. World institutions should refrain from admonishing educational institutions for promoting the so-called low exchange value courses of studies. In fact, world bodies should advocate for a balanced approach to educational development. Society and leaders on both sides of the ideological and political divide at national and international levels must have the will to lead by great example and allow education to take its natural course. As stated earlier, education is but a creature of society, and it is incumbent upon society to provide the ambience to make the quest for sanity and moderation possible. The environment cannot take on an inappropriate path and expect education to pick the pieces. The tail cannot wag the dog if the dog does not allow it. Let educationists educate in the same manner that calls have been made to let managers manage. Educators must rise to their calling for ensuring that balanced curriculum is pursued with equal vigor and passion. It is incumbent upon educationists to ensure that the cognitive and the affective domain stand in balance and in.
Assalamu alaikum. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I don't think 15 minutes will suffice, so I'll try to speak faster maybe. It is during these times that we find ourselves suspended between the fall of the world financial markets and the crowning of new hope. We live in a world which is rapidly evolving in an age of rebirth and revolution. Naturally, it would be prudent, therefore, to assume that in an age of rebirth and revolution, the successes and failures of past are evaluated and subsequently appraised. One property of this century will indeed be the importance and consequence of higher education in encountering the difficulties faced by what is referred to in our times as knowledge-based societies. The purpose of higher education may be summarized as such. It is to graduate good human beings, committed citizens and professionals, to conduct scientific and technical research for the sole purpose of advancing the stock of knowledge, to generate and propagate culture, act as a living record of the past, and radiate a vision for the future, promote creativity and innovation, something very important, and to afford leadership. The aforementioned purpose both influences and is influenced by politics, economics, and social policies. As such, there is a need for civil society to develop the competence to discuss policies, and in doing so, will simultaneously encourage the skill for dialogue. The university today is rapidly becoming a place, or perhaps even the last fortification, where the fundamental elements and values which constitute the fabric of society are defended, rather than to promote right action and responsibility. The right action referred to springs from self-discipline, founded upon knowledge, whose source is wisdom. This is what university education should be about first and foremost. The university should impart responsibility for education, consultation, and participation for family, personal property, work, peace, and the environment. Surely we are able to humbly admit that thus far our universities have not done enough in terms of teaching right action and responsibility. Instead, we have corrupted the teaching of right action and responsibility with persuasion and indoctrination. We have further been preoccupied by the market-driven notion that the quality of graduates is dependent upon documented qualification, rather than by the worth the university imparts. Higher education is truly at the core of any policy to nurture peace and encourage development. Indeed, it is through education that knowledge of right actions and responsibility are instilled. Such knowledge then forms the foundation upon which respect for the individual and for humanity in general are based. The fact that universities are established are not for the sake of the university itself. Rather, their establishment is for the purpose of civil society. It is not purely a center for learning, but rather a reflection of refinement and civilization in pursuit of true knowledge. We know, for instance, that the German tradition of the university in the 1800s focused on research and training. We also know the British tradition in the same period revolved around education for the elite, whereas in the French tradition, where university education was the sole responsibility of the state. But one should not forget the role of the madrasa in the Islamic civilization, which owed its genesis to the spread of the Islamic tradition. As a result of the modern state, we often forget the madrasa tradition, the guilds, the institution of ombudsman, the waqf, and so on and so forth. I say, as a result of the modern state, because it has somehow managed to marginalize, ostracize, and perhaps even deny the existence of an institutionalized tradition which emphasized history, theology, ethics, and correct action conforming to responsibility. We cannot forget that the madrasa system was instrumental in bringing about refinement and civilization. In our time, however, there is worrying growth in the number of universities and the number of students admitted to those universities. Such growth may be encouraging on the one hand, but on the other hand, with the added workload, teaching staff are being stretched to their limits and are forced to ignore advanced research projects. This sad state of affairs is particularly true in the developing world, where the university is suffering an erosion of purpose as the center for knowledge. Education is crucial to developing countries. The poor, by their very definition, have scarce resources. A proper education, in addition to access to good health care, are vital investments in terms of the assets they do control, namely their own labor and innovative ingenuity. The so-called knowledge economy requires specialized skills. It is also fickle. If a tradition of learning is not in place, one will surely be left behind. Primary and secondary education arms the student of learning with the vital skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic, whereas tertiary education should impart the meaning and purpose required to thrive in the workplace. the prevailing convention surrounding developed areas to maintain that investment in basic education yields much higher returns compared to money invested in higher education. The conclusion, therefore, is that higher education is a luxury which developing countries can ill afford. But the foregoing argument is no longer the case. No longer is the issue whether emphasis should be on primary and secondary education as opposed to tertiary education, but rather how education in general, comprising all levels, should complement one another. The highly educated are crucial to social and economic development, and as such, higher education is of great public interest. The ultimate prize, therefore, for moderation, namely the eradication of extremism and the return of justice, will not be possible without a renaissance of sorts in higher education systems. To overcome the problems of extremism, countries need to liberally tap into a vital resource, scholarship, not money. Nowadays, degrees and diplomas are being handed out on a scale unheard of before, to many who are less than qualified and who are, in reality, a burden to development rather than an asset. There are approximately 70 million students in the world, in roughly 7,500 universities, and perhaps more than 11,000 institutions of higher education or learning. Yet, if one were to make a comparison between the Muslim world and the West, the Muslim world spends 0.3% of its gross domestic product on research and development. The West, on the other hand, spends approximately 6% on its GDP, on research and development. Clearly, we are failing somewhere. We are not encouraging knowledge and innovation because we do not appear to possess what I would refer to as a culture of learning, nor are we diffusing knowledge competitively. And as a result, we are failing in the application of that knowledge that we know little about, and we are unable to disseminate what little we do know in an effective manner as a direct consequence of this lack of a learning culture. It is no surprise, therefore, that the Muslim world is lagging far behind the West in terms of learning. Now, as far as Malaysia is concerned, it has consistently dreamed of being the international hub for education. However, Malaysia itself lacks a unique curriculum. But the most dismal statistic in terms of higher education revolves around the fact that Southeast Asia does not possess a library comparable to those found in the West. We do not possess vast resources in terms of manuscripts, neither do we have the facilities for such. Therefore, might I propose at this conference that Malaysia be encouraged to take the initiative and establish a comprehensive library housing unique resources such that scholars will be inclined to come to Malaysia to lend their expertise. And as a result, their students will also wish to be enrolled in universities in Malaysia by virtue of the prerequisite scholastic repute. Some other Muslim countries have vast resources of invaluable manuscripts and books. However, in many cases, they have an ineffective cataloging system. From my own cursory examination, I've been able to summarize these countries having major collections of manuscripts, in other words, more than 10,000. I have to skip over this because of the time constraints. It's just a list of libraries housing more than 10,000 manuscripts, predominantly the Islamic manuscripts, in the world. If Malaysia were to establish such a library that we speak of, it would not merely be a repository for Islamic manuscripts, but also manuscripts and invaluable works from the other great civilizations. The reason being that Malaysia is truly the melting pot of different religious traditions and civilizations. If Malaysia succeeds in establishing such a library, it would truly be something unique. In order to establish such a library, however, a commitment from the government and corporations in the private sector, endorsed by the government, is required. One cannot stop at merely establishing a library such as the one proposed. Such a library should also comprise perhaps a museum, a unit for the preservation and care of such treasures, an IT facility to digitize the collection and allow for the publication and sale of certain material, a publication unit capable of seeing the publication of scholastic materials from beginning to end, and finally, and most importantly, there must be a center for the translation of the invaluable, priceless works by employing scholars from around the world to work on translating these treasures. The study of manuscripts, Arabic manuscripts in particular, is undergoing rapid and extensive change, most notably in the Western world. Public and private collections are increasingly being made available for researchers. Libraries in the West are made use of to research the growing Islamophobia and all things associated with Islam and the Muslims. Such libraries in the West also research and analyze political, religious, social, and other developments within the Islamic countries and Muslim minority populations around the world. They are also being used to reference the available materials to analyze the ideological dynamic of Islam around the world and to examine how the political and theological debate within Islam impacts both extremism and radicalism, as well as the Islamic search for moderate, just, and democratic alternatives. If such initiatives were conducted, I am sure the results of such research would encourage and support the growth of justice, moderation, and democratic alternatives to extremism and tyranny. If Malaysia were to seriously adopt this culture of learning, spearheaded by the establishment of a significant scholastic library, complete with manuscripts and rare works in all fields of learning, from each of the major traditions, it would contribute to the development of Malaysian policy options and public diplomacy efforts within the Muslim world, and to strategies to prosecute and win the battle against the radical and extreme interpretations of Islam. Such a library, I believe, would also allow for a comparative study throughout the centuries and to forecast, identify, and track the political, economic, social, and religious trends taking place and shaping the Muslim world, seeking to anticipate and understand those trends and to forecast their potential global impact. In addition, such a library may also contribute to the development of new courses for the local universities and institutions of higher learning, and to increasing community awareness and understanding of the cultures, histories, economies, and politics of the world and its societies. Such a library may also be the impetus towards a series of colloquia, guest lectures, workshops, etc., and to facilitate new and ongoing research on subjects discussed therein. Clearly, therefore, there is a growing need for such a library, given the fact that Islam is the fastest growing religion of the world. Yet, little is known about the manuscripts of the Muslim world. But let us not despair, however. Although the issues surrounding higher education are difficult, they are not insurmountable. The existing wealth generated from natural resources may be used more effectively by establishing these comprehensive libraries and resource centers like the ones mentioned earlier. Countries which continue to neglect higher education will become increasingly marginalized and suffer from slow social and political development. It would appear that we have several challenges before us. One, we need to educate the youth and teach right behavior and social refinement. We need to this right behavior and social refinement, in the Arabic language we refer to it as adab. We need to expand their stock of learning or risk losing them to exclusivity, extremism, and hate. We need to expand their stock of learning by offering the opportunity to peer into past traditions which embrace moderation, scholarship, and justice. In doing so, we are in reality straddling the traditional borders between the Muslim world and the West. Subsequently, we should be able to translate the knowledge gained into correct modes of thought and action. Before I end, I wish to thank the organizers for their hospitality and to express the hope that this movement will continue, not only here in this conference, but in the different processes to which we have alluded and many others which need relevant thought at this time of chaos. I thank you for your indulgence. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much, Dato'. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very thankful for the enlightening views and opinions from the speakers. I've just been notified by the organizer we do not have time for question and answers, because luncheon will be served in 5 minutes' time. So I'm sorry for that. I think you definitely can approach the speakers yourself for any clarification and questions. So on that note, let me thank the speakers for their indulgence and also views, and also thank you for participating in this particular session. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
A big round of applause to all the 4 speakers, our prominent scholars. And on behalf of the organizer, I truly apologize for not allocating time for Q&A. We are really behind time. And before we adjourn for our luncheon address, with the speaker, the Honorable Martin Natalegawa, Foreign Minister of Indonesia, is ready. And immediately after that, the royal address will begin exactly at 2. And before we leave this hall, I'd like to make a few reminders and announcements. Number 1, please bring along your belongings whenever you leave any particular venue. And number 2, any foreign delegates that needs airport transfer on the 19th to 20th of January, please register at the counter right in front of this hall. And the venue for the special address as well as the royal address is here in this ballroom. So please enjoy your lunch and the luncheon address. Hope to see you. Thank you.